Good evening, everyone. My name is Dina Okamoto, and I'm the director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society and a professor in the sociology program at Indiana University in Bloomington. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for the Confronting Racism series. This is our final week in the series, and for the past 7 weeks, we've been streaming live on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. on Facebook. Over the past several weeks, we've brought together experts in the arts, humanities, and social sciences to discuss a host of topics, including protest, policing, incarceration, justice, and social change. And tonight, we'll be talking about global solidarities. Now, this series was inspired by the nationwide protests against police violence and systemic racism and in support of Black lives. We wanted to foster conversations about the histories and social realities of race, racism, and anti-Blackness in the US and beyond, and to explore the modes of protest, resistance, and rebellion used to confront these thorny issues. We know that racism is entrenched in our histories, institutions, policies, and practices, and that it remains pervasive today. And so we hope that this series can shed some light on one of the most urgent and important issues of our time. So this is a series, this series is a collaborative effort between Indiana University's Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society, the Arts and Humanities Council, and the College Arts and Humanities Institute. We received support for this series by the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and the Public Humanities Project. I especially wanted to give out a shout out and recognize Ed Comentale, Michelle Moyd, Deb Cohn, Joe Hyland, Gerard Panicook, and the A&H and CREST staff for all helping to put this program together. We couldn't have done it without all of us together and working, and it's been wonderful. And so before we move ahead today, I just want to give a short definition of race, and then I'll move on to a land acknowledgement, and I'll introduce our moderator for tonight. So this definition of race, we just like to provide it before each of our series so people can understand, what we're talking about in terms of defining our concepts. So race, it's been one of the most powerful and persistent boundaries in American history, distinguishing between the experiences of those classified as non-white from those classified as white, often with significant consequences, devastating for some and uplifting for others. Race is not biological. It's a concept and ideology that was socially constructed, developed during the late 17th century alongside the establishment of African slavery as the dominant unfree labor regime in the Americas. And as the idea of race evolved, white superiority took on the trappings of common sense, and it became widely accepted as a social ordering principle. Not only did it serve as a justification for slavery, but also for the extermination of indigenous peoples, the exclusion of Asian immigrants, and the seizure of Mexican lands. Racial practices were institutionalized within US policies and the larger society, and as a result, race became an important mechanism for limiting and restricting access to privilege, power, and wealth. And as we know, race still operates as this mechanism to shape trajectories, outcomes, life chances. And so before I introduce tonight's moderator, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University was built on indigenous homelands. So we recognize the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. So tonight's moderator is Dr. Deborah Cohn. She's a provost professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University. She's also the associate director of the College Arts and Humanities Institute, and this year she's serving as the interim director. Dr. Cohn is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research includes both literary criticism and cultural history. She studies 20th century Spanish-American literature, as well as Cold War cultural diplomacy in and beyond the Americas. So briefly, one of her current research projects examines how scholars in the fields of foreign languages and literatures, as well as American studies, use their teaching, scholarship, and administrative efforts to complement official US efforts during the Cold War to win hearts and minds around the world. So I'm going to turn it over to Deb, and I really look forward to tonight's program. And again, I thank you all for joining us. And please feel free to enter your questions into the chat on Facebook. And again, we look forward to a wonderful conversation tonight.
Thank you, Dina, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. As this is the last panel of the series, I want to start by echoing Dina Okamoto's thanks to those who have made this incredibly rich and generative series happening. To Dina herself and to Michelle Moyd, as well as the staff at the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society as a whole for their energy, their commitment, their intellectual leadership. To Ed Komentale for his leadership, efforts, and support for making this come together, as well as Joe Hyland and Gerard Panekuk of the Arts and Humanities Council, and Ethan Gill for the tremendous amount of work that they've put in, and to the previous panelists and moderators who have set this space on fire with their ideas and activisms over the past few weeks. We have another panel that will continue with this, with four terrific panelists who will be speaking this evening. Kevin Brown of Indiana University's Marr School of Law, Tiffany Florvil of the University of New Mexico's History Department, Tiffany Gill of the History Department of the University of Delaware and soon to be of Rutgers University, and Sydney-Paige Patterson of the History Department at Indiana University Bloomington. Before I introduce them, I want to echo part of Dina's opening definition of race as one of the most powerful and persistent group boundaries in American history, distinguishing between the experiences of those classified as non-white from those classified as white, with often significant consequences. Tonight's panel on global solidarities engages implicitly with how race functions as a group boundary, not just within the US, but within and across nations across the globe, and with how race also functions as a time-worn motor of and justification for imperialism. Our speaker's focus, though, is not so much on how race is constructed as a boundary. Instead, they probe how international and internationalist alliances and freedom movements are forged precisely as means of resisting, challenging, and overturning race as an institutionalized ordering principle and mode of oppression. Their work also speaks powerfully to the transnational alliances that may form in opposition to gender oppression and its intersections with racial oppression. Our panelists tonight contribute to the rich and ever-growing body of scholarship on Black internationalism and the forging of diasporic Black communities, often within the context of imperialism and decolonization when, as Michelle Stevens writes regarding the first half of the 20th century, Black colonial subjects were not yet recognized as national peoples. The Cold War, too, of course, bore witness to a surge in mobilization and alliance building among people of color around the globe who were seeking sovereignty and political self-determination, and who were also calling out the US for the institutionalized racism that gave the lie to its efforts to promote freedom and democracy in the global arena. This racism, of course, continues to structure US society and politics and life. The killing of George Floyd, with its prompting of anti-racism solidarity protests around the world, as well as mobilization against local police brutality and colonial legacies of violence, has shown us how it also may foster global alliances and additionally rejection of legacies of racism and violence in other countries. After last week's panel on Indigenous perspectives, panelist Joseph Pierce described the event as being one of kin-making. The term struck me as an apt descriptor for the work of forging and acting upon the solidarities that our panelists will address today. On another lexical note, I want to point out that in Spanish, there is a verb, solidarizarse, which is, of course, from the same etymological root as solidarity. Solidarity is a noun, a state where people have come together with shared interests and concerns. Solidarizarse is the verb that describes how they get to that point and move forward from there. It is solidarity in motion, solidarity is agency, and it is the topic that our speakers tonight will discuss with us. And with that, I'm going to turn to introduce our first speaker, Sydney-Paige Patterson. Sydney-Paige Patterson received her BA in African American and African Diaspora Studies and English from Indiana University, Bloomington. She is also a graduate of the John W. Draper Interdisciplinary Master's Program at New York University. She's currently pursuing a PhD at Indiana University in African Diasporic History with a minor in India Studies. Her research examines transnational social movements throughout the 20th century, focusing primarily on how Black Americans have inspired or contributed to the formation of radical movements for freedom around the world. Her dissertation research utilizes ethnographic and archival methods to interrogate how Black and Dalit women contributed vital intellectual labor to the Black and Dalit Panther parties during the late 20th century. She was recently awarded a 2020-2021 Fulbright Nehru Fellowship to complete her dissertation research. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Patterson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohn. I'm so happy to be here and be part of this conversation. As stated in my bio, my dissertation research focuses on how Black and Dalit women contributed intellectual labor to the Black and Dalit Panther parties during the late 20th century. For reference, Dalit is a term meaning oppressed that members of the untouchable caste in India used to describe themselves. Generally, my research is interested in examining radical transnational social movements and their lasting impacts, as global solidarities have always been a part of anti-racist work. I especially enjoy looking at how these transnational alliances intersect with the African diaspora. What I have found and continued finding are these moments of continual contact between movements of liberation around the world, all intersecting with Blackness in particular ways. For example, in 1946, there are letters of exchange between W.B. Du Bois and B.R. Ambedkar discussing how the Dalit and Black struggle relate to each other. Ambedkar is a famous Dalit scholar who wrote Annihilation of Caste and also contributed to the Indian Constitution after India's independence from Britain. Ambedkar, in particular, wrote to Du Bois seeking a level of exchange and support between Black Americans and Dalits, especially as Du Bois was heavily involved with the Pan-African liberation movement during that time. Du Bois's work with the Pan-African Congresses allowed him to connect with anti-colonial activists from West Africa, India, and the Caribbean, and these are happening in places like London, Paris, Harlem, just all over the world. And this tradition of hosting congresses continued well into the 20th century. Jumping ahead, the Pan-African Congress of 1969 discussed the importance of centering Palestinian liberation struggles to struggles for Black liberation, and this is a trend that's continued to the present day. Literary scholar Edward Said's 1989 article, Intifada and Independence, discussing Palestinian liberation, includes the Du Bois quote from The Souls of Black Folk, "How does it feel to be a problem?" That's kind of rhetorically inviting a comparison of Black and Palestinian struggles. And this type of comparison and use of language exists not only with Said, but with Dalit right activists Jyotirao Phule and Ambedkar, and other activists who draw inspiration from Black American writers. During a trip to India in 2015 with Professor Kevin Brown, who's also a fellow panelist, I met with so many Dalit activists who drew on work from Frederick Douglass, Toni Morrison, Angela Davis, the list goes on. And in writing their own narratives, many Dalit writers, especially Dalit women, make references to the Black American experiences of slavery and lingering injustices in its aftermath. I'd also like to emphasize the way that women, and especially Black women, were embedded in these international exchanges. One of my personal sheroes, Eslanda Roberson, traveled from the US to Europe and Africa, writing about liberation from colonial powers, and in doing so, developed relationships with China, India, or with activists from China, India, and the Soviet Union, and several African countries as she traveled with and without her husband, Paul Roberson, from like the 1930s until like the 70s and 80s. Angela Davis, also traveling around the world, and especially to India, just recently in 2016 gave a lecture discussing the importance of liberating Dalit and Black lives, showing that the fight for freedom is not just a localized national problem, but an international one. My work is building from all these historical developments to examine the centrality of women and women's minds to the building and sustaining of these movements, especially ones that are viewed as hypermasculine and patriarchal. I've really been taken with the writings of wives and girlfriends of these activists because in reading their perspectives while often silenced, the conversations about liberation are taking place in private or domestic spaces, around kitchen tables, on stoops, in backyards, where women are present and contributing important ideas that shape these movements. So a lot of my work is investigating through memoir, poetry, or other creative works, how women are building their own political consciousness within these movements that speak to their realities and center their unique experiences, which are often and importantly separate from men's. I think this work is so relevant for the present moment, especially our present protest movement, because oftentimes it seems like the coalitions built between activists only exist for certain moments in time. But if we think of our present moment as a result of the Black Power tradition, or building on these transnational linkages between activists that were developed over time, we can better conceptualize what it means to sustain them in our present moment, and how to build out of a tradition where we already have plenty of resources. So I look forward to discussing this and other things with the fellow panelists, but thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
That is terrific, Sydney-Paige. It's very exciting research, and I look forward to hearing more about it. Our second speaker tonight is Kevin Brown. Professor Brown is the Richard S. Melvin Professor at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. He's been on the faculty of the law school since 1987. He's a 1978 graduate from Indiana University Kelley School of Business and a 1982 graduate from Yale Law School. He teaches race and law, law and education, and a seminar on transnational inequality, comparing issues of discrimination of Blacks in the US with Blacks in the UK, Blacks in South Africa, Dalits in India, and Arab Israelis, Palestinians in Israel and Palestine. His research interest is primarily in the area of comparative inequality and US race law. An original participant of the critical race theory workshop in Madison in 1989, Professor Brown has published 2 books and over 80 articles or comments on issues including comparisons of struggles of Blacks in the US with those of Dalits in India and Blacks in South Africa. Brown's current book project is tentatively entitled Caste Analogy Remix: The Benefits for the Black Community for Comparing Their Liberation Struggle to that of the Dalits in India. Welcome, Professor Brown.
Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much. And it is, of course, a pleasure to be here. And I want to definitely thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. My work right now primarily deals with comparing the struggles and building alliances between African Americans and Dalits, the group that you heard Sydney-Paige talk about. But in doing that work, I've come to learn that Dalits have been inspired by the African American struggle. They've created the Dalit Panthers, which you heard Sydney-Paige talk about. They've also created Dalit capitalism inspired by Black capitalism. They've created the Dalit Lives Matters movement even before George Floyd, inspired by Black Lives Matters movement. They sing "We Shall Overcome" in some of their meetings. They draw very heavily on African American women's literature and definitely use the concept of intersectionality in discussing patriarchy within the Dalit community. So that's where my work is. But I want to talk about how I came to this work, because I came to teaching here at Maurer in January of 1987. And my first trip to India took place as a Fulbright scholar in 1996, December 1996 to May 1997. That was my first time going there. But I was one of the original participants in critical race theory. So I was involved in it from its very beginnings in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. And CRT was the first true scholarship movement by law professors of color teaching in predominantly white law schools. So for most of us, we were either the first or second professor of color teaching at our law school. And if you know anything about critical race theory, you probably know about Derek Bell. Derek Bell was the first tenured Black law professor at Harvard, and he was one of our CRT scholars. Derek, among other ideas that he made famous throughout his illustrious career, was the idea of racial realism. Racial realism effectively meant that Black people were oppressed in the United States, and this oppression was a permanent aspect of American society. So no matter what we did, we would never be able to change that stark reality. So for the first decade of my teaching law, I was deeply embedded in a scholarly movement that was somewhat pessimistic. Of course, when you say racism is permanent, that is what it means. And our focus really was on how to help Black people struggle against this racial oppression. But given the history of race relations in America and given the focus of our struggle, what it meant was that we would always evaluate the situation of Black people in the United States in comparison to non-Hispanic whites. And since non-Hispanic whites tend to have more of what is valued than we have, in those comparisons, we as Black people always ended up being too poor or too unemployed or too undereducated or too underrepresented or too often victims of unnecessary police violence or too often locked up unnecessarily behind prison walls. And even if there was progress on our road to equality and we recognized it, it almost always came with a concomitant acknowledgement that there was still a long way to go. So the fire of virtually every one of our victory celebrations was ultimately drowned in a flood of despair that comes from recognizing that there's so much more work to do. But then I spent this 1 week in India, and it was Christmas week 1996, which was actually my second full week there. And there were two events that really changed my scholarship and my thinking about the African American struggle in deep, very, very profound ways. The first one of those events was a 6-hour train ride with a law professor of Indian descent who was teaching in South Africa. And she and I got into a discussion about the African American situation in the US and how Blacks in South Africa understood us compared to how we understood ourselves. And of course, I gave her all the negative statistics that one could give about the condition of the Black community. And after about a 35-minute effort of laying out my description of our situation, she looked at me in shocked and stunned amazement, and then came back to me and said, "Kevin, I just don't believe you. To Black South Africans, we see African Americans as very powerful people. When we think of American politics, we think of your civil rights movement and everything that you were able to accomplish. When we think of Black music, we think of jazz, we think of gospel music. When we think about American athletes, we think of the Black athletes. So we see Black Americans as extraordinarily powerful people." My second then event occurred just the following week. And it was where I attended a rally of 80,000 Dalits who were rallying to change their constitution. And there were 3 speakers. One of them one spoke in English, so that was the only one I could understand. And that speaker started off by saying, "I'm a Dalit Panther. We take the name Panther from the Black Panthers of the African Americans because we see ourselves as one with their struggle." And there was one sign over the speaker's podium, and that sign was, "We shall overcome." So the work I kind of do gives me an alternative view of the African American struggle. I get to see the African American struggle from a far more positive light. And in doing that, I get to talk about what our struggle has meant for other oppressed people throughout the world. But that also means something very important for African Americans. First off, it means that the beneficiaries of our victories against racial oppression do not end at the American shore, but indeed can reverberate and inspire others throughout the world. It also means that the African American struggle is far more important than we realize, because it's not just a national struggle, but it really is an international struggle. And taking an international perspective on the African American struggle means one obtains more knowledge about our struggle. But I suppose for me was probably the most important thing is when I really thought about who it is African Americans would want to inspire if they could. It would not be the wealthy to obtain more wealth, and it would not be the famous to obtain more notoriety, nor the intelligent to read another book. No, we would want to inspire the most depressed and downtrodden people in their struggle to throw off their oppression. And that, my friends, is exactly what we do. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deborah.
Thank you so much. They're really, some of the phrases that you had were just absolutely powerful. And I particularly like what you said about the Dalit saying we see ourselves as one with the struggle of African Americans. And I think that that's what this panel is about. So thank you. Our next speaker is Tiffany Florvil. Tiffany Florvil is an associate professor of 20th century European women's and gender history at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in the histories of post-1945 Europe, the African Black diaspora, social movements, feminism, Black internationalism, gender and sexuality, and emotions. She received her PhD in modern European history from the University of South Carolina and her MA in European women's and gender history from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She's published pieces in the Journal of Civil and Human Rights and the German Quarterly. She co-edited the volume Rethinking Black German Studies, and has published numerous chapters. Her manuscript, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women, and the Making of a Transnational Movement, is forthcoming from the University of Illinois Press, and it offers the first full-length study of the history of the Black German movement of the 1980s through the 2000s. She serves on numerous committees and editorial boards, and her next project examines the activism of Black diasporic women in 20th century Europe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Florville.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to say thank you again for the invitation. I'm so excited to be a part of this. So as Dr. Cohn just mentioned, my work examines the modern Black German movement of the 1980s to the 2000s. And this is not to suggest that earlier forms of Black German activism didn't exist. You certainly have individuals such as Anton William Amo from sort of 18th century Jena. You also have Hendrik Witbooi from German Southwest Africa in the 19th century. So I want to sort of clarify that, but I'm particularly turned to sort of late 20th century activism of Black Germans, and I want to try to understand their political and their intellectual activism, as well as their forms of internationalism or their sort of articulations of internationalism. And I see that their forms of activism and expressions of Blackness in particular certainly built on earlier diasporic traditions. Certainly in the colonies, in European metropoles, and across the Atlantic. And here I want to sort of explain a sort of brief note that like there's a longer lineage of African Americans coming over to Germany. You have J.C. Pendleton coming over to Germany in the 19th century. We have MLK, Martin Luther King, coming over in 1963 to sort of Berlin as well as Frankfurt. You also have Angela Davis after she was freed coming over to Germany in 1972 and 1973. And you have a variety of other sort of activists coming over. The Du Bois, both W. Du Bois as well as Shirley Graham Du Bois were in Berlin and East Berlin in 1958. The Robesons, both Paul and Isleta Robeson, were in East Berlin in 1960. So we have this longer lineage of interracial and transnational connections. And so Black Germans are certainly building upon that. And their mobilization also resulted from a transnational connection with Audre Lorde. So Audre Lorde is this phenomenal Afro-Caribbean feminist who was teaching at the Free University in Berlin in 1984. And a variety of Black German women were participating in taking those classes. And so conversations with her, conversations with one another really helped to really sort of encourage them and mobilize them and embolden them to create a movement. And what they did resulted in the establishment of two critical organizations. The first organization, was called the Initiative of Black Germans, or ISD. And the second organization is called ADEFRA, or Afro-German Women. And both of these organizations were both cultural and political organizations, membership-driven organizations, as well as having sort of this larger Black internationalist perspective and practices embedded in both of these organizations. The latter organization, Deborah, is also considered the sister organization to ISD, and is oftentimes had a more concerted feminist agenda. And so they're building on this, and they're creating these two organizations, and they also help to create a new lexicon and grammar. And this helped to shift discussions of German identity, notions of race, colonialism, and belonging. They also use a lot of their organizational events. They sort of created a Black History Month celebrations that began in 1990 in Berlin, and then eventually eventually occurred in other cities like Munich, Frankfurt, and Hamburg. They also established a variety of seminars, historical seminars, sociological seminars, poetry readings, anti-racist protests, and all of these different activities, along with the organizations, really show how Black Germans were pushing a particular type of intellectual labor and creating a type of intellectual labor. And their social interactions within these organizations across the country. So there's organizations that sprouted up in Berlin, in Bremen, in Frankfurt, in Hamburg, in Munich, and so on. And all of these organizations, all of these local ISD and ADEFRA chapters really show how they created a particular type of knowledge about race, racism, racialization, colonialism. They also theorize about race. They're theorizing about notions of difference. And they also really help to sort of gain more recognition for Black Germans. It's also during this time when, in the 1980s, when they're sort of connecting with Lord as well as connecting with one another, that they're creating this, as I mentioned, this lexicon. And what I mean by that is they're actually creating the concepts of Black German and Afro-German, that prior to this point, you only had derogatory and offensive concepts that referred to these individuals. And so they're really trying to create empowering labels that really decenter the gaze from sort of white Germans and really sort of pushes their agency to the forefront. And they not only sort of use these organizations, there are a variety of important individuals who helped with this. So you have individuals, as I like to refer to them as sort of Black German activist intellectuals. And you have Maya Eam, you have Katharina Obentoya, you have Jasmine Edding, you also have Tahir Della, you have John Kantara, and the list can go on. And they're forging solidarities, they're forging connections, and the movement itself was inherently global. I mean, Black Germans, I should preface, come from a variety of backgrounds. Some of them are biracial, some of them have sort of a white German mother, or African-American father, or an African father. Some of them are also African immigrants. So there's a very sort of complex sort of community that entails or encompasses the Black German community. And so you also have them forging connections across those differences that I just mentioned. So they use their difference as a way of creating new forms of belonging, creating a new sense of being, both individually and sort of collective notions of what that constitutes. And they use it also to forge additional transnational networks. So when I'm talking about sort of individuals, for example, like Maya Eam, she was able to forge connections not only in Germany, so they're forging sort of grassroots internationalist connections in Germany with other people of the Black diaspora who are sort of migrants, refugees, students, artists, etc. But then for Maya Eam, she's also forging connections with individuals across the globe. So she's connecting with individuals in South Africa, she's connecting with individuals in Brazil, she's connecting with individuals in Vienna and the US. So many of them in the movement really sort of looked outward as they're also looking inward to create more recognition and representation for themselves within the German nation. And in addition to this, I think what's so fascinating about this is that what the Black German movement does, it really challenges in some respects the heteronormative order of things in the German context. So it really, in many ways, they recognize their position as already being marginalized and excluded. And they use that marginality to sort of center issues about race and racism in very interesting ways. And they also try to sort of, you know, push back on sort of normative notions of not only sort of identity, but also normative notions of gender. And there are a variety of feminist activisms who were, you know, queer, lesbian feminists who really felt compelled to do more on the German landscape. And so this project really has sort of stirred an interest in looking at larger dynamics of Afro-diasporic or Black diasporic activism in Europe in the 20th century. So not only sort of looking in the context of Germany, but also looking at Switzerland, looking at the Netherlands, looking at the UK, and so forth. So I look forward to additional questions and comments from everyone. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. I also look forward to additional questions and hearing more about the project. I'll introduce our next speaker now, Tiffany Gill. Tiffany Gill, as she mentioned before, will be joining the faculty of Rutgers University in the fall of 2020 as an associate professor of history. She was the inaugural John and Patricia Cochran Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at the University of Delaware. She is the author of Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry, which received the 2010 Letitia Wards Brown Memorial Book Prize by the Association of Black Women Historians. And she is also co-editor with Keisha Lane of To Turn the Whole World Over. Professor Gill's research has been supported by various foundations, including the American Association of University Women and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and an award-winning teacher and a nationally recognized expert in African American women's history, fashion and beauty culture, business history, and travel and migration studies. She has provided expert commentary for various news outlets, including National Public Radio, C-SPAN, CNBC, Fox, and the New York Times. She also serves as a consulting partner for History Studio, which provides research and help with project development for film and television industry. Named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians, Gill has also been recognized by Diverse Issues in Higher Education as one of the top 25 women in higher education. Welcome, Dr. Gill.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to participate in this forum, mainly because the faculty at Indiana University are really doing some amazing and cutting edge work on race in various ways, faculty and graduate students. And so it's wonderful to be a part of this forum and this discussion. And so I've sort of titled my brief remarks. I'm just going to have a few images for you all to look at, because I think with my project, the visual archive is so important that I want you all to kind of get seated in it. So I'm going to start with the story in the summer of 1960, when 50 members of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, the oldest Greek letter sorority of African American women, embarked on a trip to Africa. Coming just 2 years after the establishment of their first chapter in Liberia, members of the organization were eager to learn more about the rapidly changing continent. While Black American missionaries, artists, activists, and educators had been traveling to Africa for centuries, the direct commercial travel in the form of air travel to the region was a relatively new phenomenon. However, the AKAs knew someone who could help them in this new terrain. They enlisted Freddie Henderson, a Spelman College professor and fashion designer. You can go ahead to the next slide for me, please. Who, along with her husband, Jacob, opened the first African-American owned travel agency to serve international destinations just 5 years earlier. For the AKA trip, Henderson chartered a DC-9 plane out of Paris for an educational and leisure tour that included stops in Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco. As the Hendersons led the AKAs across the continent, their journeys received extensive media attention. Black and white readers in the US and abroad were fascinated by everything from what the women wore to the ways they described the cultural treasure they encountered along the way. Once they arrived in Nigeria, the Daily Service, a local newspaper known for its alignment with the anti-colonial movement, felt compelled to explain the sorority women's curious presence in Nigeria to its readers. Dispelling any idea of an ancestral diasporic connection, the article explained that, quote, the AKAs have not come to Nigeria to trace their origin. Instead, the paper highlighted that the women's interest in Africa, especially Nigeria, and emphasized that above all, they were there to, quote, see a nation moving fast to independence. In other words, these women came to get a glimpse, albeit temporarily, of Black freedom. This trip occurred during a particularly dynamic global moment. As reflected in the Daily Service article, the AKAs visited Africa just as nations like Nigeria were casting off their colonial rule and becoming independent. The AKAs would be leaving Africa and returning back to the US just a few months before the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and during the summer when student-led sit-in movements emerged throughout the South. The burgeoning civil rights movement, as many scholars have noted, was part of a wider post-World War II era global Black freedom struggle that witnessed decolonization movements moving across Africa, the US, and the Caribbean. These significant geopolitical shifts, which scholars often talk about, were joined by other kinds of historical shifts that scholars of African American history haven't talked as much about. Namely, the technological advances in aviation that ushered in the jet age, making it quicker and cheaper for Americans to travel abroad. Still, for all of their sense of mission and purpose, the connections the AKs made to their own freedom struggles back home while they were there, and the high regard with which they held Nigeria on the cusp of independence from British rule, their first days on the continent were filled with complaints about the accommodations and the stark contrast between the US and Africa. Many of these complaints echoed preconceived notions about African primitiveness that many of the women brought with them on the journey. According to Jacob Henderson, after the first night in Senegal, some of the women pleaded, quote, "Mr. Henderson, get me out of here," complaining that there were, quote, alligators in their room, when, as Mr. Henderson noted, they were just some lizards. However, by the end of the trip, Henderson said that the women enjoyed themselves and ended up leaving with an appreciation for the cultures and peoples they encountered and were eager to encourage others to visit the continent. So this one small example from my current book project gets at the heart of the paradoxes around global racial solidarities that I face in my work. Civil Rights on Vacation, Leisure, Politics, and International Travel During the Long Black Freedom Struggle, my book, examines the complex interactions between Black-owned and operated, African-American owned and operated travel agencies, transportation companies, government bureaucracies, and Black travelers themselves to historicize the development of an African-American international tourist industry. It demonstrates that international leisure travel is an important lens through which to examine some of the most significant and overlapping global phenomena impacting Black people globally since World War I. Specifically, Civil Rights on Vacation highlights the ways that African-American travel entrepreneurs, like the Hendersons, through their excursions to Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean, navigated tensions between the joy and pleasure of travel with the hovering notion of building global solidarities. As such, this project seeks to move beyond a discussion of civil rights and leisure and focusing on consumption to attempt to disrupt our ideas about what all of those categories mean. Next slide, please. And so as a historian of African-American leisure, my research archive is saturated not only with stories like the one I shared, but also this visual archive, replete with happy, sometimes glamorous expressions of joy among African-Americans. And so when I reflect on and think about the work that I do historically in this particular contemporary moment that we face, this moment that is pregnant with pain, but also with possibility, I have to admit that sometimes my work and the kind of work and the people that I study seem like a diversion at best, or people who in some ways function in ways that are counterproductive to building global Black solidarities. Put simply, the African-American folks I study are having too much fun. And not only are they having fun, but their ideas of fun, particularly when they travel to Africa and the Caribbean, is predicated on the continued exploitation of Black and brown people in those regions. So I have this kind of tension. I also think about the tension of the ways that as African Americans and US passport holders, when they travel abroad, they are in many ways bearing the brand of American imperialism, and parts of why they can travel so freely abroad is directly because of America's treatment of others in the world. But I still think, as I immerse myself in the visual archive and in the textual archive, that we need to look at these Black international travelers who not only had the desire to embrace mobility as a liberatory practice, but had the audacity to chronicle their observations. I've come to realize that their work, rather than being completely counter to the aims of racial solidarities, past or present, but that they're a helpful lens to help us elucidate the promise and perils of global solidarities. However, the question remains, how do we explore the ways that these Black travelers help to show the pleasures and peril of global solidarities and Black freedom struggles? In some ways, I see my work sort of grappling even with some of the work that I've heard so far of people who write in the Black radical tradition. I think a lot of Robin Kelley's work, particularly his work around freedom dreams. And while Kelley focuses his work on the Black radical tradition, I'd like to include within this notion of freedom dreams some decidedly non-radical folks, and we can talk more about these folks later, into this discussion, these Black leisure travelers, mainly Black women. And so no matter how messy or complicated their narratives may be, these international leisure travelers remind me that not only do Black lives matter, but so does Black living. Thank you.
That's great. You speak to these skewed lines of cause and effect, of motives and means and goals. And there's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna pose a question that I'd like for all of you to speak to a little bit, which is not just what your projects are, which you've already done a great job with, but tell us why you have done this research. You've alluded to this in many of your positions, where you position yourself in relation to what you're working on, as well as the other places, geographic, intellectual, or both, where your research has taken you. I can't, I'm having trouble seeing on my screen where people are. So if people would like to jump in first, because I'm having technical difficulties, please go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in first. Mine actually turns out to be quite an interesting story. I had been going back and forth to India for a number of years. And you heard Sydney talk about Dr. Ambedkar. For the $200 million, Dr. Ambedkar is the person. He's the first one to get a PhD from Columbia, a doctorate degree from the London School of Economics. He was a member of the bar in Britain. He will be the chairperson of the India Constitution Drafting Committee. So in that way, he's sort of like their top lawyer, like Thurgood Marshall. And then he starts the first Dalit political party. So in that way, he's sort of like Jesse Jackson. He was their first real massive organizer of Dalit people. And in that way, he's like Martin Luther King Jr. And he creates a new version of Buddhism, one that did not exist before. And on October 14th, 1956, he has a mass conversion of $600,000 to his form of Buddhism. So he is a major, major player. And I had been going back and forth to India dealing with the Dalits before I actually hooked up the reality that the one Dalit that all Dalits would say is the greatest Dalit we have, at the very moment that he was converting 600,000 Dalits to Buddhism in India, I was being born in the United States. So it made it look like fate.
That's great. Next.
I can follow.
Hey.
Tough act to follow though. I don't have a birth story, unfortunately, but that was amazing, Professor Brown. So I came to this topic during my master's program because I was deeply influenced and interested in the global solidarity work during this time. So I started my master's thesis during the Black Lives Matter protests of 2014 after the death of Michael Brown. I participated in some of the marches in New York City while also working with Delaware women activists who were attacking both anti-Blackness and caste hierarchy. So around the time that I was doing my master's thesis, there was also information coming out about Dalit History Month. And I was really interested in writing my master's thesis on kind of how Blackness intersects with all these movements around the world. And I came across an article, you know, it's a random article talking about the many different iterations of the Black Panther Party. And I found the Dalit Panther Party and I was like, this intersects with all the things that I'm interested in. And that's kind of how I got started on my path. And I ended up linking up with Professor Brown in 2015, and we went to India and Israel and Palestine together. And in the following years, as I went into my doctorate, I was really just interested in seeing how women are involved in these spaces as well, and how feminism is an important part of this conversation. Not just looking at how men are oppressed by caste or race, but also how women just kind of like produce their own narrative this time. So it was just like an unfolding, a slow unfolding of understanding this topic. So
That's great.
Hey, I will go if it's okay. Oh, okay. So I don't have like an awesome birth story either. I mean, I have a hilarious like personal story in which the initial interest in sort of German history / culture was due to a pen pal that I had in middle school. And then I visited her family while I was in high school for a summer and thought it was a great place. And then I was awarded a Congress Bundesstaat scholarship to study abroad. And so I was an exchange student for a year and I lived in Hamburg. And I think it's through the course of my living in Hamburg that I experienced overt and covert racism on a daily basis. In my school, someone shouted and laughed and called me the N-word. I experienced stuff in my neighborhood, and then I also just experienced really interesting things throughout the city. And so I think it's through the course of those experiences in which I kept seeing like the contradictions of Germany. On the one hand, Germany is touted as this progressive anti-racist space. Hitler is gone. The ideologies are put to rest. But the reality of that was that no, race was still ever present, very omnipresent, and omnipresent in ways that spoke to the silences of race as well. So, and just how pervasive it was in the everyday. So for example, just my host family was lovely. Like they never made me feel uncomfortable, but it's interesting how the different concepts are sort of common in the German language. And so, you know, at one instance, my host mom was like, would you like this chocolate kiss, which is now called chocolate kiss. But back then it had another name and she called it that other name. And I looked at her like, what's going on here? So I think it's a variety of these experiences for me that made me feel compelled to learn more about Black people in Germany and the origins of the African diaspora in Germany. And I'm also intrigued by like these studies of the diversity of the diaspora, which certainly Black Germans, you know, fit into some of the narratives that are common in African American communities. But then in many ways, they are different in terms of thinking about the German colonial legacy, thinking about the sort of demographics of Black Germans in the sort of pre-45 space. So I think a combination of those things really propelled me to sort of study this, in which I'm studying sort of like issues of Blackness, the diversity of the diaspora, and how Black Germans represent. They're not necessarily tethered or tied to the Middle Passage narrative that is also common for individuals of the African diaspora in the Caribbean, Latin America, or the US. And so I think I'm interested in those sort of interesting differences that allow Black Germans to sort of are similar to others, but then also are actually quite different from others in the diaspora.
Terrific.
Yeah, I'll tell my origin story. I came to this work in some ways out of frustration. Actually, anyway, I was frustrated. And where it really started was the book Beauty Shop Politics about African-American beauticians. I noticed in the 1950s that groups of beauticians were flying to Europe to partake. They were saying that they were going for professional development and to study with the French masters of beauty work. But really what they were going to do, were using that as sort of an excuse or a justification for them to take these epic European adventures. Epic. I mean, we're talking 39 days and they're starting in one part of Europe and they're going through the others. And it wasn't just interesting to me that those trips were taking place, but that the Black press was obsessed with them. And wasn't just obsessed with it. So Ebony magazine has an 8-page pictorial, you know, the Black press, you know, Chicago Defender, all the Black newspapers are. And again, this is in the moment of the Black freedom struggle, right? The 1950s and 60s. And so I was really just trying to figure out how to make sense of these trips. But what became frustrating to me was that there was nothing in the history, the very robust, amazing historiography on Black internationalism that helped me understand these women and helped me understand leisure travel at all. Even though when you look at the Black press, it is, and I say this particularly in the 1950s and 60s, it is obsessed with Black people traveling. Like, that's not exaggeration. Like, if you don't believe me, go scroll through the Chicago Defender. They had travel columns, and not just travel, but international travel in particular. So I wrote a little chapter in Beauty Shop Politics. It's the shortest and probably most undeveloped chapter in the book, but I was just haunted by this. And I was angry mainly because internationalism was this robust discipline, but there was no place where women were so dominant, because most of the travelers were women, where consumption and joy and pleasure and leisure took hold. So the first step of that, working through that frustration, was me trying to find a historiography for these women. And that led to Keisha Blaine and I collaborating to co-edit an amazing, what I think is an amazing collection, because I don't have an essay in it, so I can say it's amazing. And Tiffany Florvil has an amazing essay in it, so it's amazing, to help contextualize that. And what we ended up thinking about is, okay, in order to really bring out, and I think Sydney-Paige's work talks about this a bit too, in order to really highlight and bring out women in internationalism, we have to change our scope of it, right? I love the way Sydney-Paige was talking about, you know, thinking about what wives and girlfriends are doing, right? Like, which seems kind of off the side and frivolous, but because I think that the terrain and the parameters around what constitutes internationalism, which is often a very narrow vision of a Black radical idea, that the ways that women engage and use material culture, in that consumption, the ways that things like, I say that, you know, fashion becomes one of the most radicalizing ways for Black women to experience the world, right? Like, through, so there are all these interesting ways. And so that anthology was really a way to make sense that when we center Black women in stories about internationalism or global solidarity, the categories we use have to be transformed to make room for these stories. And I always say that the women that I study had a much greater impact on Black global ideas in the world than many of the kind of radical thinkers that we read and write about all the time. These women were school teachers, so they would come back from the continent with, you know, African art and clothing. They were Sunday school teachers, and they would talk to them about church. So they're writing in the Black press, they're these images. And so it's really kind of laying into that. So that's a part of the global solidarities. And then also, I think, just thinking about Black leisure and what role does leisure and fun and pleasure play when we think about politics. So that's how I came to this work.
That's terrific. And I want to build on something that you just said, to pose a question to you and to Tiffany Florville and to Paige in particular, and Kevin, come in as you see fit. The question is, you know, Tiffany, you just talked about the need to center Black women in discussions of global solidarity, and in order to do that, the categories have to be changed. And Tiffany Florville, you were talking about women, queer women, and who use their marginality to push back on normative notions of race and gender. And all the three of you each deal with the centering of Black women, and I want you. I hope that you can build on that further to talk about the roles of gender alliances, the roles of different gender categories, and different forms of exploration of research in your work. And let's see.
I mean, I can sort of just pick up where I ended just
Yeah.
really briefly. I think one of the ways is that, you know, our very archive, particularly in terms of historians, of how we go into the archive and what constitutes our archive has to really shift when you center women, right? So I said things like material culture and fashion and all of those kinds of exchanges. And for travel, you know, and this is something that I've done some work with, collective that includes a lot of artists. We produced an anthology, I think they're going to include the name of it, called Women in Migration. And it's an exchange of artists as well as historians, lit folks, you know, really truly interdisciplinary work. And those folks have pushed me into this visual archive because, of course, when you study travel, you know, even to this, like, their pictures, right? You know, from modern photography. And I was at first thinking about the way, using those pictures in the way that often historians do, which is like, you just have some pictures in the book to illustrate, but to really think about the visual archive and what it is saying, right? And how this becomes a way for these Black women positioning themselves in the world and seeing the world through their eyes. And how were they talking about race globally? How are they talking about solidarities among women? How are they talking about movements, right? That some of that is coming through their pen, but because, and Sydney-Paige said, it's like, you know, we have to be really creative when looking at, you know, finding Black radical women. Well, if we pivot the archive to include visual archive and leisure travel and consumption practices, Black women are at the center. I didn't go into this looking for Black women travelers. It's just that the majority of travelers who are going are often, in the beginning, it's some men. In the early part of the 20th century, by the time we get to the post-war, it's women. So just by pivoting that, they're not coming home writing treatises about global solidarities. They didn't do even what Islanda Robeson did, where she came back from Africa in the 30s and she wrote a journal. They're using their scrapbooks and their photo albums, right? And so I think the way I would say is like rethinking the archive by centering women in stories of racial solidarities.
I just love everything you just said, just all of it. And I've been like writing down quotes from like all the things you said, including just like Black Living Matters, because I love that so much. I just had to say that. But I just wanted to respond. A lot of my work thus far has been really geared towards India and looking at Dalit women. And kind of like what you were saying about the archive, I ended up looking at a memoir by the wife of one of the founders of the Dalit Panther Party. And I found it randomly because a friend like mentioned it offhand, like, oh, there's this book, but no one really brings it up because they don't want to damage the name of this like great founder of this party. But in the book and in the translated version of the book, it's basically just kind of like, this woman's so sad. She's just so sad. Her life is sad. Everything is sad. And I'm reading this memoir and she's challenging her husband at every account, like just like all of his ideas. She's like, you're talking about humanism and you're talking about being good to people, and yet you do not treat me well. So how can we talk about this better? And how can we expand even the notions that you're trying to bring up and argue for, and how they're flawed because they don't include women? And she's calling out patriarchy, calling out all these things. And it just seemed unfair to me that her experiences in her memoir and like the way she's talking about herself and how she positions herself is completely sidelined by this story that, oh, she's just the one. Or, oh, her experiences aren't valid in this space. And so I really just kind of wanted to piggyback on what you were saying about expanding the archive to include like the poetry of women, written sources, oral sources, just all kinds of other sources that provide a glimpse into an alternative life and the development of alternative ways of thinking about liberation. So.
Can I piggyback on that and just perhaps you could elaborate just a second? When you were when you opened, you said that you came to your project in part because of the different places where the conversation were happening. And you mentioned on the stoops, on the porches, and that's another way of expanding the archive as well.
Yes.
And yeah, would you like to say better?
I was just gonna say, sorry, Zoom, I'm working on it. But I was just gonna say, I was really inspired by the memoir. It's called I Want to Destroy Myself by Malika Amar Sheikh. And I was really inspired because she was talking about how all these ideas about what the party's gonna do and where they're gonna go is happening at her kitchen table. And she's just like, I'm over here making tea and you guys are like having these conversations and I'm involved. And I just felt like, how can we talk about these parties if we don't talk about the women that are present and there and contributing? So
that's great. Tiffany, Florville?
I think in terms of, I think my work tries to expand what we consider Black freedom struggles. So we oftentimes sort of see them as sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, and my work really tries to extend that chronology to the 80s and the 90s when we sort of talk about the sort of early moments of the Black German movement. And my archive actually was Black German women who I emailed and, emailed some of them for my dissertation research. And they, some of them were like, okay, let's investigate her. And then they sort of met me at a cafe. And then after that, they were like, okay, she gets it. Oh, she's read. She's not, coming, she's not coming empty, uninformed. And then they would take me to their homes and show me sources that they'd collected. So, for example, one of the sort of key sources that's in the book was basically a variety of like minute meetings from Black German, one of the Black German organizations, so ISD, as well as sort of minute meetings from Deborah. And she had this all in like a suitcase and a folder. And she's like, do you think this will be of interest to you? And I was like, what? This is wonderful. Wow. And then the second thing was that like over 20 boxes of Maya Eames stuff was in a Berlin basement in another activist home that I helped transport from one Berlin basement to another Berlin basement. So the material had been sitting there from like 1996 to like 2011. And that person was moving, another sort of Black German activist who was involved in that DEFRA was moving and was like, this stuff, I can't take this stuff with me. And so I think my archive was Black German women who had kept the notes, had kept the material, and were keen on keeping the material and, creating these archives in spaces for, changing knowledge. This is, I think, one of the things that I didn't mention is that I think that the Black German movement was very much about an epistemic intervention in which they're really pushing for a new way of knowing what constitutes Germanness, what constitutes race, and also what constitutes Blackness. And so I think that's what's so interesting about these women. And I shouldn't suggest that like Black German men weren't in the trenches as well. But I think for me, Black German women are the glue that help keep the movement together in some ways. They really make a political and intellectual intervention in ways that really help to push the men. Like, for example, DEFRA forms in some ways because there's quite a bit of misogyny in ISD. And this is certainly not uncharacteristic. We see this within the Black Panthers. We see this with Students for Democratic Society. So we see that this misogyny is embedded in leftist culture. But for Black German women, they're sort of also pushing back against that misogyny in the Black German community, but they're also pushing back against their erasure in the larger leftist culture in Germany, in which Blackness doesn't have a space at all. It's rendered invisible. And so they're really trying to sort of push against, white German feminists, white German men, leftists. They're really trying to change whitewashed approaches to politics and really, really push a Black leftist agenda. That really sort of not only engages with individuals in, South Africa or, Austria or London or the Netherlands, but really engages with this larger tradition of diasporic activism. And I think that's been largely pushed by women. They're creating some of the literature in the earlier stages of the movement. They're writing poetry. They're writing sort of queer books and literature that sort of mixes genres. And then they're also sort of queering spaces. They're sort of not only, much like Sydney's work, where these women were sort of initially meeting in like kitchen tables, and, you know, and then going to cafes, and then sort of occupying or embedding themselves in major spots in cities across Germany. So there's a lot of interesting sort of Black geographies created, Black knowledge production in place within the movement.
That's great. Kevin, did you want to add anything? Or
Yeah, actually, I think I can. I've led 3 different groups of academics and 3 different groups of students to India, primarily to interact with knowledge. And a majority of the people I lead, probably about 75%, have been African Americans, but a majority of them have been women. And one of the real difficult issues in talking about building alliances between African Americans and Dalits is the misogyny that exists within the Dalit community. Because it's the first thing that Black women talk about, is how much misogyny they experience. And it's one of the things I always talk about with the Dalits is, given the fact that for 30 years, twice as many Black women had gotten college degrees as Black men, the Black academic is more likely to be a woman than a man. And therefore, it's very important that the Dalits overcome their misogyny if this alliance is going to occur.
great. Well, we have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one that was addressed to Dr. Gill, but I think that it builds on some of the points that have been made, but I think that you each have something that you could add to it. So question is, Dr. Gill, can you say more about why the women you are studying were sidelined in the Black internationalism historiography? What does this elision reveal about how we think of Black people in certain moments of the 20th century? And I think that there are various angles on from the discussions of the role of misogyny in these transnational alliances. But I don't know if you'd like to start with that, and then others could jump in if they wanted to.
Yeah, I definitely think other folks can have lots to add to this as well. I think it has to do, you know, just simply with kind of misogyny, and a particular kind of misogyny that I think exists in racial political struggles, right? Because a lot of it is around the idea of race being being the primal thing, that if you're dealing with it in this kind of an anti-racist approach, that it's very hard, and Black women of the past and of the present are still negotiating and talking about kind of intersectional kinds of issues. And I think what ended up happening, so that's there, but then also there's the erasure in the scholarship. And of course, I'm not saying that there was none, but that I think the very parameters of how internationalism were framed privileged Black men's interventions in terms of how scholars have analyzed it, right? So if Black internationalism is framed, particularly even just framing it around radical politics in some ways, there certainly were vibrant groups. I think both Tiffany and Sydney-Paige's work show us, that there are vibrant groups of women engaging in these radical movements, but they were often dominated by men. And the spaces of internationalism where women dominate, like travel and consumption, were dismissed as not being able to tell us. So I think it's both a matter of, the actual sort of misogyny of the moment in the movements, but also we have to think about how as scholars, how even the ways that we set up our fields of inquiry and what constitutes internationalism, right? And that's the thing, like you go through the scholarship and there's some work, some really great work around leisure travel. But when you look in the Black press, that was the main conversation about globalism, was about travel, right? And so why as scholars is that erased? And so I think it's just, when you're doing Black women's, working on studying Black women, you have to first question the very parameters of even how our scholarship works, because often those are not privileged, the ways that they contribute. So Hope that helps. But.
Yes, that's terrific. Other people would like to respond, or if
Yeah,
not,
I guess, yeah,
okay.
I'll just pipe in quickly. I think in terms of the Black German case, women have always been privileged. And I think the problem in that, I mean, so Black German women have always been privileged as a site for the origin narratives of the Black German movement. So what is interesting in terms of that is that it's oftentimes gendered as, you know, as a mostly female movement, even though it was not. And then you have a limited discussion about, you know, Black German men. And so you do have some of the scholarship now trying to sort of engage with that. So like you have quite a few Black German men who were active then, who remain active now. And so the narrative is really sort of gendered female, and it's oftentimes tethered to Audre Lorde. And as a result of that, you sort of lose their other international connections in the process. So in my book, I try to show their other connections to not only Lorde, but other diasporic individuals in Germany, and that their sort of grassroots internationalism wasn't contingent upon travel per se, that like they could forge that type of internationalism just by walking down the street in Berlin and connecting with a migrant from Ghana, or their Black German compatriot from Bremen whose parents are from, you know, Nigeria, or, you know, or a white German mother from like Bremen. So I think that's what's so interesting, that like it constitutes a part of the nation in some respects. They're sort of grounded within the nation, but yet they also venture outside of the nation to continue to forge these sort of global solidarities.
That's great. Sydney-Paige, did you want to say something?
No, I don't have too much.
Kevin?
No,
okay.
no.
All right. Thank you for the remark, Dr. Brown, about the tension between progress and despair. It's inspiring to hear that the global perspective affirming of one of the most it's inspiring to hear the global perspective that affirms one of the most revolutionary social progress movements. And the question asks, I wonder if the lack of recognition and acknowledgement of progress and resistance in the US is perpetuating the despair and we have a long ways to go mentality. I think they were speaking about your conclusion where you talked about the how the victories in, which is fabulous.
No, yeah, of course I get this question all the time. No, of course there's no question that the fight against racial oppression in the United States is a very real fight, and it's one that has to go on. There's absolutely no question about that at all. What I try to do is also offer an alternative perspective to say, hey, look, keep in mind that there are these other things that we've been able to do. We've also been able to influence liberation struggles in other places throughout the world. So keep in mind that there's this really positive aspect of our struggle. And in some ways, my hope is it means that we feel the struggle here isn't as hopeless. And that in fact, we can say, yes, there is something really positive that we're doing. Because it does seem to me, you know, when I think of the $200 million, they don't read George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or the American founding fathers when they talk about what they should do in terms of liberation. They read Malcolm X, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. And I think that's significant.
That's great. Tiffany Florvil, we've got a specific question for you, which is, do you observe the intellectual and cultural influences of Afro-Cubans and Angolans in Germany and former East Germany? Are these dialogues still present? How about the impact of Afro-Brazilians in Germany, since there's a large Afro-diasporic Brazilian community in Berlin, represented especially by religious practices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the book that my forthcoming book focuses, primarily on sort of biracial Black Germans, as well as sort of second or third generation African or Asian migrants. And so it's a narrative that's primarily sort of discusses West Germany and then reunified Germany. So I don't go into much detail about Mozambique, Tanzanian migrants who are in the East. I don't go into much detail about sort of Vietnamese migrants who are in the East. So I don't talk about those racial politics, even though I talk briefly about racial politics in East Germany. So both West and East Germany in their constitutions really try to sort of push for this notion of equality within the law. And that in East Germany in particular, racism is, only associated with their German colonial legacy or the Nazi past. So they're like, hey, we're not racist. We don't even need to evoke the term. So and then what's interesting, if Black East Germans talk about instances of like everyday racism, they're actually labeled as racist. If you talk about race, then you're racist. So we certainly have heard this, in terms of like our sort of common day trolls who are like, oh, you're racist if you mention race. And so both, even though ideological differences, sort of capitalist West Germany and communist East Germany, there's still sort of an ideology of race in which both countries refuse to really talk about it and really silenced it. And simultaneously for the East, they're engaging in this global solidarity politics in which they're inviting members of SWAPO. They're really invested in communist liberation groups across the globe. And then they're welcoming, they're working also contract laborers to the country. And so this sort of narrative doesn't figure in as prominently as I'd like, but another sort of side project that I'm doing is working on Shirley Graham Du Bois's experiences in Germany, so specifically East Germany. And she's writing with East German women. And so part of that project is sort of teasing out the complexity of these connections and seeing how she sees herself in relationship to these individuals, why East Germany for after the coup in Ghana, she also contemplated for a while of living in East Germany. So there's something about East Germany as being this symbol. Even though simultaneously it was also terribly racist. So for its international prestige, it claims its anti-racist identity, but the reality was far different from that. So sadly, I don't focus on these communities as much as I would like, but I think I'll get into that through discussions of Shirley Graham Du Bois, that you see these communities, that she's not necessarily engaging with these communities who are oftentimes were segregated in spaces in East Germany. So they're in working barracks, consciously separated from other white Germans, or sort of SWAPO children were placed in barracks that were separate from East Germans. So I think there's an interesting dynamic there that I can tease out a bit further with a discussion about Shirley Graham Du Bois.
That's great. Well, there's one question, a final question I'm going to put to you, which is asking basically about, in the wake of this is for everyone, the murder of George Floyd, the anti-racism marches and protests, and the questioner writes, they don't know where, we don't know who was always marching where or the connections, but they are asking about how the action of the outside of the US in the last few months was related to places, to the alliances that you study and the exchanges that you have studied. To the extent that you could answer.
I can take, because I was actually in India meeting with Dalits at the time of Michael Brown being killed by the police. And, the mood here, the African-American community was, right, once again, here we go. Another Black person killed by a police officer, another one of these senseless killings. And, we have to come out on the streets, we have to complain about this. When will this ever stop? And yet, when I was with the Dalits, the way they interpreted it was, see how the African Americans treated. When someone kills one of them, they come out into the streets, they protest, they get mayors fired, they get police chiefs fired. We need to be more like the African Americans. We need to be more forceful in our protest. And it was just a stark difference in how that same events were being perceived in two different communities?
I think with my work, it helps explain, I think, some of the dissonance that's happening globally, so that you can have massive protests in Paris and all these other places on behalf of Black American lives, while Black populations in these areas are not treated well and are facing a lot of the same things, right? So I think that's been a really interesting dissonance between kind of, you know, places, particularly I'm thinking Europe and other areas where, you know, they're sort of celebrating not celebrating, but, you know, participating in protests about Black life, but also treating African Black people within their countries terribly. And the way that it resonates with my work is one of the things that's sort of interesting to navigate is that African American travelers would always talk, particularly about Europe, as this racial utopia. There's some exceptions, but there's this, I'm treated better here, and I'm, like, this is where we escape. And that was true sometimes, but it was also untrue a lot of the times. And it certainly was the case that they knew that they were Black people that were living in these spaces who were catching it, right? And so what's interesting to me, though, is how Black American travelers would frame that. Even like you can read, Robert Abbott, who was the head of the Chicago Defender, the owner of the Chicago Defender, traveled abroad a lot in the 1920s. And he would come back with write these missives in the Black press, talking about how great and how much of a racial utopia and an absence of racism existed in Brazil and South America, right? And it's fanciful, even while he would talk about how London was such a wonderful place, even while he was discriminated against and was not allowed to stay in a hotel there. And so I think a lot about this kind of dissonance that the Black travelers themselves kind of made. They had to make another place better, even if it wasn't always better, because that was a part, I talk about it as a strategy to shame the US and US racism, even though anti-Blackness is global. And so there's this kind of tricky way that, you can treat, Black folks who aren't in your nation state better than you can treat the ones in your nation state. And so just the cognitive dissonance, or the difference between reality and behavior, is something that I thought about when I saw a lot of these global protests.
That's great.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of the global protests that are taking place in Europe, namely Germany, Berlin, Munich, there was a variety of sort of Ferguson is everywhere campaigns, hashtags that emerged in 2014, and I basically end my book with like a discussion about Black Lives Matter movement in Berlin specifically, and how that emerged in like 2016 due to like this interracial group of German feminists, many of whom were sort of Black German feminists. And so I think what's interesting about the sort of German case, as well as sort of other cases in Europe, like sort of Paris and London, is that they use this incident of sort of George Floyd or Mike Brown or whomever the victim is to not only sort of align themselves with these larger anti-racist protests, but to also strike back at Europe and strike back at the status quo, and to say, look, colonialism is an issue still. These sort of neo-colonial presumptions. We are not a decolonial space, even though you claim us to be, and that we're here because you were there. So all of these protests really try to illustrate that racial profiling is prominent in Germany. That police brutality is prominent in Germany and in London and in England, and in France. That like Black people in France, a recent case in 2017 in which a Black French man was sodomized by the Parisian police. So like these are not limited to America alone, but they use these moments to really push attention for like Germans to realize, look, you guys are also racist. That like we should not. We need legislation to ensure our equality here as like citizens within the nation. And then for Germans in particular, they're also pushing for census that actually is able to sort of categorize who is a person of color, who's Black German, who's Turkish German. They have no figures about this. So like estimates about Black Germans is anywhere from like 500,000 to 800,000 people. And that's lower than sort of Turkish German population, which is about 2 million. And so I think they are pushing for an Afro census and pushing for this quantitative data so that they can use this to then chart and try to make more substantial legislative changes. And so this is something that's, certainly you see a similar dynamic in France. So all of these protests, like all of the sort of statues coming down, in Belgium, in London, in Birmingham, etc., are all about this sort of colonial history that is so pervasive to European notions of itself. And these protests really are as a sort of catalyst for like Europe to get that, like, we're not a raceless society. We've never been a raceless society. Even in the medieval ages, we were not raceless, even though the notion of race as a sort of category as we know it, the modern notion of forms a bit later, but there's still practices of racialization that are embedded in the DNA of Europe. And so these protests push to that. They say, look, colonialism matters. Racism is a issue here. We still experience all of these things here too. And then Brexit is another complicated matter in terms of thinking about like extreme heightened xenophobia, as heightened anti-Semitism, not only here in the US, but also in Europe, and Islamophobia. So all of these things combined. So you do have Black activists in these streets, but then you also have people of color in these streets trying to push these discussions about racism more broadly.
That's great. Sydney-Paige, would you like to say?
Just a short note. I thought that was a really interesting question, because even in my work and in my travels, I've been examining like how Blackness is kind of like marshaled as a symbolic in many ways, as a symbolic like status within this international discussion. And sometimes what gets picked up and what narratives get picked up often centering men and men's activism and kind of like the death of George Floyd, whereas the mention of the death of Taylor, like who's allowed to be highlighted within these discussions. And so like what gets picked up and brought over or taken internationally is not always the full part of the story. And like who's working behind the scenes, how Black Lives Matter was, started by three Black queer women, and how central that is understanding the movement. So I'm always thinking about just kind of like, what work is Blackness doing in this international context, and how can we expand that to incorporate the lived experiences of Black people within different nations, other places, and also just in the United States, a variety of Black people. So
that is a fabulous way of wrapping this up. So, and I really thank you for saying what you've just said about the work that Black women are doing in this global sphere. And you have all really given me so much and the audience so much to take home and think about. And I want to thank you so much for that, for your effort, for your energy, for everything you've invested in this. And you have really, this has been a terrific way to end the series, and to make us want more, frankly. So I want to thank again our panelists, our organizers, the supporters, and our audience who have been here with us for the past few weeks. This has been such, again, an incredible and stimulating series. For those of you who may have missed an event, you can find previous sessions archived on the websites of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity and Society and the Arts and Humanities Council. The link should be going up in the Facebook feed right now, as well on the on the Center's website as a list of additional readings and resources. So again, thank you so much to everyone for this. And I know that I'm glad that I have to walk partway home because I have got a lot to think about. And thank you for everything you've done, and just have a good evening.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
This has been fabulous.